Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander, I'm BK, and we're back with another game from Murders at Karlov Manor. First up is Scott playing Duskana, the Rage Mother. This thing's bear tribal, but not really bears. It's got Disguise, Morph, and Manifest all day. Voja, Jaws of the Conclave, is being piloted by J-Man. It's like wolves and elves had babies. Next up we have Kovacs playing Anzrag, the Quake Mole. He's going after extra combat phases with this adorable mole. Next up is me playing Mirko, Obsessive Theorist. The plan is to surveil a lot and reanimate big scary things. You should follow us on Instagram and Discord to stay connected to our growing community. And stick around for an appearance from a fat cat meatball. He's so chunky. Scott kicks us off by playing Jetmir's Garden and passing over to J-Man, who also plays a Jetmir's Garden. Can you believe it? J-Man then passes the turn over to Kovacs, and he also plays a Jetmir's Garden. JK, it's a mountain. But he then uses that mountain to play Skull Clamp. He passes the turn over to me, I draw, and then I play a Command Tower as my land for turn, before passing it back over to Scott. And on his turn 2, he plays a Stomping Ground, having it enter the battlefield untapped at the cost of 2 points of life. He then casts Nature's Lore. This will have him go find a forest card in the form of a Temple Garden. Secret Lair drop. He passes over to J-Man, who draws. Then he plays a Forest as his land, and he follows that up by casting a Territorial Witch Stalker. Hey, it's a wolf, and it'll be able to attack later. On Kovacs' turn, he draws and plays a Forest as his land before casting Agatha of the Vile Cauldron, hoping to reduce the cost of his activated abilities later on. I draw and then play a Clear Water Pathway as my land for turn before casting Fell War Stone, getting some ramp on. Over to Scott, he draws and plays a Fabled Passage. As his land, he cracks that bad boy immediately and goes and finds a Forest, and that'll enter the battlefield and untap. He then drops Panoptic Projector. This thing will allow him to cast his face-down things for cheap and double up on their triggers should they flip. So he uses it to pay for a face-down thing and then passes the turn over to J-Man, who plays Branch Loft Pathway as his land, and then casts Gwenna, Eyes of Gaia. This thing will help J-Man cast creatures, and if it's big enough, he could do it again. On Kovacs' turn, he draws and plays another Forest as his land before casting Augur of Autumn. Now we can start looking at the top of his library and maybe playing lands. And he does so before passing the turn over to me, keeping Agatha back and playing nice. I play a Polluted Delta as my land, and then I cast my commander, Mirko, Obsessive Theorist, with nothing in my graveyard yet. But that's okay. I then crack my Polluted Delta, finding a Sunken Hollow, and passing the turn over to Scott. After he draws, he decides to flip over his mysterious creature, and it's a Nervous Gardener. And because of his Panoptic Projector, he'll go and find 2 lands with the basic land type, and put it into his hand. So he grabs a Sacred Foundry, as well as a Forest, putting both of those into his hand. Then he plays the Forest as his land, and casts Toski, Bearer of Secrets. This thing can get him some card draw if he deals combat damage to an opponent, and he tries to do so right now with his 2/2, fully knowing I have a 1/3, so I just block that. He passes the turn over to J-Man, who plays a Sacred Foundry as his land for turn, shocking that bad boy in. Then, with the help of his Gwenna, he casts his commander, Voja, Jaws of the Conclave. When that hit the stack, Gwenna's like, yo, give me a +1 counter and untap me. And with his commander out, J-Man is now threat number 1. He then uses his Gwenna once again to help cast his Imperious Perfect, pumping up all of his elves, and perhaps making elf babies later on. On to Kovacs' turn, he plays another mountain as his land before casting Hero's Heirloom. He wants to give trample and haste to a thing. He also casts Resurrection Orb, giving lifelink to a thing if it's equipped, and saving it from death. Afterwards, he passes back over to me. I play Otawara, Soaring City, as a land, and then I cast Enhanced Surveillance, allowing me to look at more cards whenever I would surveil. Then I surveil by casting a Dimir Informant, and when that ETBs, I'll surveil 2, but in this case, it's replaced, and I get to look at 4. So Mirko says, yo, give me a +1/+1 counter. Now, all of the cards that I just surveilled were lands. So I put 3 basics into the bin and a Watery Grave back on top, because I could use that. Then I go to combat at J-Man, the threat, and then I ping him for 2 points of commander damage. Watch out. On Scott's turn, he plays that Sacred Foundry that he grabbed earlier, taking 2 damage, and then, using his Panoptic Projector once again, he pays a reduced cost for a mysterious creature. He then casts Essica's Chariot, gaining 2/2/2 green cats onto the battlefield. Then, as a follow-up play to that, he casts Safi Eriksdatter. This will allow him to save something from death once. He moves into combat because he has to with his Toski. I easily block it, preventing him from drawing a card. He passes over to J-Man, and he plays a fancy Windswept Heath as his land, cracking that, taking 1 life, and finding a Stomping Ground. And for the low cost of 2 points of life, he'll have that enter the battlefield untapped so that he could use it right away. He drops Beast Caller Savant. This is a hasty mana dork. After that, he activates his Imperious Perfect, so he gets a 1/1 elf token and names him Tony. He then moves into combat, which will trigger his commander, Voja, and this thing gets pretty serious pretty quick. He has 4 elves on the battlefield, so each creature gets 4 +1/+1 counters on it, and he gets to draw for each wolf he controls. Voja needs to die. I chump block with my Dimir Informant. Voja tramples over the top, but I have a surveil thing in my graveyard now that I can reanimate. After combat, with the help of J-Man's Mana Dorks, he casts a Circle of Dreams Druid. This thing's like Gaia's Cradle on a stick. Then he passes the turn over to Kovacs. He peeps the scene on top of his library and found a forest that he was able to play right then and there. Can you believe it? He then casts Leyline Tyrant. That thing can help him store red mana for later use. Afterwards, he equips his Skull Clamp to it. In case it dies, he'll draw 2, which is pretty good. He passes the turn over to me. I play a Watery Grave, shocking it in, and taking 2. Then I decide to play Extract from Darkness. So each player will mill 2 cards, then I can reanimate a thing in a graveyard. I'm hoping that this will allow me to reanimate something that could deal with J-Man's board. I'm pretty flooded, so this was pretty much a desperate play in order to do something. I did find a Massacre Worm off of my library. After assessing the targets in my opponent's graveyards, I think Massacre Worm is the best play. So I reanimate that. When it ETBs, it'll shrink all of my opponent's things by -2/-2, and killing a bunch of them, at least from Scott's board. And now, every time a creature dies, the controller loses 2 points of life. So, Scott will end up taking 10 whole life, J-Man taking 2, and Kovacs taking 2. In response to Massacre Worm, Scott had activated his Safi Eriksdatter and brings back Toski after the resolution of Massacre Worm's effect. After all that, I swing at J-Man in the air with Mirko, dealing him 2 points of commander damage. I will then move to my end step, and I'll get Dimir Informant back out onto the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Then I'll surveil 2, but again, with enhanced surveillance, I get to look at 4. This will trigger Mirko, giving another +1 counter, and I put 4 more cards into the bin. 2 more of them being lands, and 2 being actual things that I care about. On to Scott's turn, he plays a Whisperwood Elemental. This will have him manifest things at the beginning of his end step. He must swing with Toski, and he does so at J-Man, who easily blocks, and then Scott manifests something on the end of his turn. Over to J-Man's turn, he draws, and then he plays a Forest as his land. With the help of his Mana Dorks, he casts Tolsimir, Friend to Wolves. When that ETBs, he also gets Voja, the little Voja, not the big Voja. It's a 3/3 wolf, and when that enters the battlefield, Tolsimir says, yo, have that wolf fight a thing. So little Voja fought Augur of Autumn and killed it, and J-Man also gained 3 points of life. Kovacs lost 2 when his Augur died thanks to my Massacre Worm. J-Man made another 1/1 elf and named it Doug. He then moves into combat. Big Voja triggers, giving 6 +1/+1 counters to all of his creatures, and then he gets to draw 3 whole cards because of how many wolves he has. We have to find a way to deal with Voja. He attacks me with all of his eligible attackers. Chump Big Voja with Massacre Worm, soaking up as much commander damage as I can, and then put Dimir Informant in the way of another thing. I take a bunch of damage going to 10, J-Man passes. Kovacs played a mountain before casting his commander, Anzrag the Quake Mole, in that cool dossier artwork. He then gives a sword to his mole. Hero's Heirloom gets equipped, giving it trample, haste, and +2/+1. He moves into combat, swinging Anzrag at Scott, who activates his Essica's Chariot before blocking, therefore blocking with it, and his manifested creature, which is enough to kill Anzrag. But, because it was blocked, Kovacs gets an additional combat step. On the first combat phase, he dealt 5 damage to J-Man in the air with his Leyline Tyrant. But then, in the second combat phase, and mostly out of spite, he attacks Scott with Leyline Tyrant this time, dealing 5 points of damage, dropping him down to 17. He then passes the turn over to me. I draw, hoping it's a board wipe. It's not. It's the Ancient One. Between Kovac, Scott, and I, we have like 36 pieces of spot removal and like 9 board wipes. So, anytime now. Activate the Ancient One, drawing a card and discarding a card. I discarded Night Veil Sprite, which has me mill 2 cards from my library, neither of which are helpful reanimation targets. I do my due diligence and I attack J-Man in the air with my commander, and he decides to Chaos Warp it, just adding salt to the wound. I'll have Mirko go back to my command zone, but I still resolve the rest of Chaos Warp, shuffling up my library, and then I'll reveal the top card of my library. If it's a permanent, it sticks. It's an island. I need no more lands, deck. But I get an island out, so that's something. On Scott's turn, he plays Ayula, Queen Among Bears, which is not a board wipe, Scott. Then he casts Fade from History. So, each player that controls an artifact or an enchantment gets a 2/2 bear. This is Scott's way of trying to be helpful and giving us more blockers, which we appreciate, Scott, at the cost of our enchantments and artifacts, which all get destroyed. J-Man had none, so he gets no bear. Also, when Ayula ETB'd, it got 2 +1/+1 counters. Then Scott has to attack, so he attacks Toski at J-Man, which is correct. And on the end of his turn, he manifests the top card of his library. On to J-Man's turn. He draws and then plays a mountain before casting Universal Automaton. Then he activates his Imperious Perfect once again, so he'll get an additional 1/1 elf token and named him Brian. He then decides to cast Ren and Realm Breaker. Really, he's just looking at the -2 ability, which he then decides to activate in order to mill the top 3 cards and put a permanent from among them into his hand, hoping that one will be an elf and therefore getting him more +1 counters when he attacks. He found an old Gnawbone instead and went to his hand. He moves into combat. Voja triggers, giving 8 +1/+1 counters to all of his creatures, and draws a bunch of cards due to all the wolves that he has. After doing all sorts of mathematics, he decides to swing out in such a way that he deals lethal damage to each of his opponents simultaneously, making him the winner. Congratulations, J-Man. Who knew that Voja would be incredibly powerful without any interaction whatsoever? Yeah, so this video's just a showcase of how strong Voja is, right? Anyway, as promised, here's Meatball. He's so chunky. We'd also like to give a huge shout out to all of our Patreon subscribers. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you'd like to learn more about the benefits of becoming a Patreon subscriber for us, feel free to head over to patreon.com/mostlycasualcommander. You'll get things like early access to videos, exclusive access to our patron-only Discord chat, and more. Join us on Instagram, and if you haven't subscribed already, we'd really appreciate it. It truly helps. Thanks for watching.